Once upon a time, in a village hidden deep among mountains that seemed to scrape the heavens, there lived a young man named Marco. He was just 24, the age when the body is strong and the spirit should be full of fire. Yet his face carried the shadow of exhaustion. While the people around him lived their days with the rhythm of the seasons, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, resting in winter, Marco's heart never seemed to settle. His mind was like a restless river, flooding its banks, filled with ceaseless currents of thought from the moment he awoke until late in the night. Marco's thoughts chased one another like clouds driven by a storm. Some were memories of his past moments that carried regret, words he wished he had spoken differently, mistakes that clung to him like heavy stones. Others were visions of the future, dark with uncertainty, frightening with their endless what-ifs. This storm of memory and imagination left no space for calm. He forgot how to sleep soundly, and even the simple act of smiling felt like something lost long ago. In the village, elders often said that the mountains taught patience. They have stood for millions of years, an old shepherd once told Marco, yet they never hurry, never collapse under the weight of time. Learn from them, but Marco could not. Where others saw calm ridges and eternal stillness, he saw only the reflection of his restlessness. The mountains rose like questions he could never answer. It is important to remember that Marco was not alone in this. For centuries, people across cultures have felt the same torment caught between the weight of yesterday and the fear of tomorrow. In medieval Europe, such souls often sought refuge in monasteries, hoping the cloistered life would quiet their thoughts. In Asia, some took to the forests to live as wandering hermits, listening to the silence of trees. In every corner of history, human beings have wrestled with the same question. How does one silence the storm within? Marco, though he lived in a small mountain settlement far from the noise of cities, felt no peace. The irony was bitter. While nature surrounded him with quiet, his mind remained the noisiest place of all. His neighbors sometimes noticed his absent gaze when he should have been working. Marco, they would tease gently, your body is here, but your spirit walks elsewhere. And in truth, it was so. His spirit was always drifting in the shadows of memory, or into the unlit corridors of what was yet to come. One evening, as he sat alone by the edge of the village, he overheard travelers speaking. They spoke of a place beyond the hills, a hidden village where a remarkable old man lived. This man, they said, had once been a great psychologist in the city, respected by the learned and sought by the troubled. He had helped countless people find clarity in their minds and balance in their lives. But when age caught up with him, he chose to leave behind the endless rush of city streets and make his home in the embrace of nature. Now he lived quietly, and though he had retired, sometimes he still welcomed strangers who came seeking peace. The words of the travelers lit a small flame inside Marco. Could it be true? Could there truly be someone who understood the storm of thoughts? Someone who knew the path toward calm? He imagined this old man, weathered by time yet carrying a serenity that Marco could not even begin to fathom. For the first time in many years, he felt not despair, but curiosity and a fragile thread of hope. That night Marco barely slept. As the pale light of dawn spread across the peaks, he made his decision. He would leave his village, his familiar mountains, and journey to the hills where the wise man lived. He told no one, for he feared their doubts might weaken his resolve. Instead, he packed a small bundle of food, filled his flask with mountain water, and stepped onto the narrow path that wound between the ridges. Thus began a journey that was not merely a walk across land, but the first step into a deeper story, one that countless seekers before him had undertaken in their own ways. Pilgrims had once set out for holy shrines, wandering scholars for distant teachers, and now Marco, a simple villager, was following the same ancient rhythm of human longing. The journey was not simply toward a village in the hills, but toward an answer that humanity had chased across centuries, the meaning of peace within the human heart. Marco's departure from his mountain village was quiet, almost secret. He slipped away as the sun began to climb, its golden rays falling on rooftops still wet with dew. His neighbors rose to tend their animals, repair tools, or prepare bread, unaware that Marco was leaving in search of something far greater than a day's work. With each step, the familiar sights faded. The fields where he had once played as a boy, the stone pots worn by generations of feet, the distant echo of a shepherd's flute. Behind him, life went on. Ahead of him lay uncertainty. The road wound through the mountains like a ribbon cut by the hands of time. Marco carried only a small bundle and his stubborn determination. The days stretched long. The climb tested his endurance. while nights beneath the stars reminded him how small he was in the vastness of the world. He felt hunger gnaw at his stomach and blisters rising on his feet, yet the thought of the wise old man kept him moving forward. In earlier centuries, journeys like this were common. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, to Canterbury in England, or to holy shrines scattered across Asia and the Middle East. For many, the physical hardship was part of the transformation. The road itself was the teacher, stripping away comfort and distraction until only determination remained. Marco was, in his own way, a pilgrim. Though he sought no shrine, he was seeking a truth that could not be found at home. The landscape shifted as he walked. He crossed narrow bridges over foaming rivers, passed through forests where the air smelled of pine and damp earth, and climbed ridges from which he could see valleys spread out like maps below. Sometimes he encountered strangers, traders guiding mules laden with salt and wool, children carrying baskets of firewood, old women selling herbs gathered from the slopes. Some greeted him kindly, offering bread or water. Others simply watched in silence, recognizing in his determined eyes the mark of a seeker. Every encounter whispered a reminder of history. For centuries, mountain paths were lifelines of commerce and culture, carrying not only goods, but also stories, songs, and wisdom from one valley to the next. To walk those paths was to touch the footsteps of countless souls before him, merchants, monks, fugitives, lovers, all carried by their own reasons to cross the mountains. Marco's reasons were different, but he was part of that long chain of wanderers who sought something beyond themselves. The journey was not without danger. Once, as twilight descended, Marco heard the distant howl of wolves. Fear tightened his chest, and he quickened his pace, clutching a walking stick as if it were a sword. Another time, a sudden storm drenched him to the bone, and he spent the night shivering beneath a rocky overhang. Each trial deepened his resolve. He began to understand that finding peace would not be easy. It would demand patience, endurance, and humility. After many days, when the weariness in his body seemed unbearable, he finally saw it, a small village nestled in a hollow between the hills. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and terraced fields spread like green steps up the slopes. The place seemed untouched by time, carrying a tranquility that Marco had not felt in years. As he entered, children paused their play to watch him, and elders greeted him with quiet nods. There was something different in the air, slower, softer, as if the very heartbeat of the village pulsed at a calmer rhythm. At the far edge of the village, Marco found what he had been seeking. A small house stood, almost hidden by vines and greenery, its wooden beams weathered by years, but strong. On the porch, seated in stillness, was the old man. His eyes were closed, his breathing even, his presence serene. It was as if he had become part of the house, part of the earth, part of the silence itself. Marco felt a wave of hesitation. After so many days of struggle, what could he possibly say to this man who seemed already to know the answers? Yet his heart, heavy with restlessness, pushed him forward. He stepped closer, bowed slightly, and spoke in a voice barely louder than a whisper, "Grandfather, my mind is restless. I cannot stop thinking. I carry sorrow for the past and fear for the future. I long for peace. Can you help me?" The old man opened his eyes slowly. They were calm, ancient eyes, the kind that had seen much suffering yet learned not to be consumed by it. A smile spread across his face, not a smile of amusement, but of understanding. And in that simple moment, Marco felt that perhaps he had indeed come to the right place. The air around the small house seemed different from the rest of the village. The vines that covered its walls swayed gently in the breeze, their green leaves whispering like a secret chorus. Birds perched on the wooden beams, unafraid, as though the house itself were a sanctuary not just for humans, but for all living creatures. Marco stood at the porch, his feet heavy with fatigue, yet his heart strangely lighter now that he was in the presence of the old man. The man sat cross-legged on a low wooden bench, his hands resting gently upon his knees. His eyes had been closed, but when Marco's trembling voice reached him, they opened slowly, revealing a depth that startled Marco. They were not simply eyes of age, but eyes that carried the weight of countless stories and the softness of countless acts of mercy. Marco repeated his plea, almost as though to confirm it to himself. "Grandfather, my thoughts never stop. They run like wild horses. I cannot sleep. I cannot laugh. I cannot find peace. The past torments me. The future frightens me. Please help me." The old man did not answer right away. He regarded Marco with a silence that was neither cold nor distant, but steady, deliberate. Then, at last, he smiled. "So, you're looking for peace. he said in a voice that carried both fragility and strength, like an ancient instrument still capable of music. Then come with me. I will give you a small task. Marco hesitated. A task? He had expected wise words, perhaps a sermon about the mind or the soul. But the old man rose from his bench, his steps unhurried, and motioned for Marco to follow. They walked into a little yard behind the house, where herbs grew in clay pots and a narrow path wound between stones polished smooth by years of use. There, on a simple wooden table, stood a glass pitcher of water and a single clear glass. The old man picked it up and poured until the glass was so full that the water trembled at the rim, one breath away from spilling. He then held the glass before Marco and said, "Take this, walk from here to the edge of the village, and then return to me. But remember, spill not even a single drop." Marco blinked, bewildered. He had traveled across mountains, endured storms, and faced hunger, only to be asked to carry water. His pride bristled, yet his heart reminded him why he had come, not to argue, but to learn. With careful hands, he accepted the glass. This moment so simple echoed with the resonance of countless traditions. Across cultures, wise men and teachers had often tested their students not with words, but with actions. In the East, monks were asked to sweep courtyards for years before receiving teachings. In the West, novices tended gardens in silence before hearing sacred texts. The lesson was always the same. True wisdom is not in theory, but in lived experience. The old man, whether he spoke from psychological knowledge or spiritual insight, was following that same eternal path of teaching. Marco lifted the glass, steadying his breath. The village beyond the yard was no longer just a place of quiet fields and curious children. It had become a stage for his test. He knew that to succeed, he would need to devote all his attention to this fragile cup of water. The old man watched him with that same calm smile and said only, "Go." And so, Marco stepped forward, the glass trembling faintly in his hands. He felt the world narrowing, as though everything his sorrow, his fear, his journey had condensed into the fragile circle of water before him. His story, he realized, was about to change. Marco stepped out of the yard, the glass balanced in his hands, filled so completely that even the faintest tremor might cause it to spill. The air outside was alive with sound, children laughing and chasing each other across the narrow lanes, shopkeepers calling out their wares with practiced voices, dogs barking as though announcing his every step. Life in the village carried on with all its noise and energy, but for Marco, none of it seemed real anymore. His world had shrunk to the rim of the glass, to the water that quivered with each careful breath. He walked slowly, step by step, his arms stiff with concentration. A boy darted past him with a stick in hand, pretending it was a sword. A woman shouted from a balcony, calling her children home. A cart creaked as an old man urged his mule forward. All of these sounds reached Marco's ears faintly, like distant thunder. Yet he dared not look up. His eyes clung only to the glass, and the glass alone. The villagers soon noticed. They paused to watch the stranger walking with such caution, as if each step were a matter of life and death. Some smiled knowingly this was not the first time they had seen the old man give such a task. Others whispered to each other, curious what the lesson might be. But no one interrupted him. They understood instinctively that he was engaged in something sacred, something that was more than it appeared. Marco's arms began to ache from holding the glass so steady. His breath grew shallow, and sweat gathered at his brow. But he pressed on, reaching the edge of the village where the road bent toward the hills. He turned carefully, his heart pounding, and began the long walk back to anyone watching. It might have seemed trivial, a young man carrying water from one end of the village to the other. But history is full of such tasks that appear small yet contain entire worlds of meaning. The samurai of Japan once practiced endless drills of sword forms, not for battle alone, but to learn presence. Medieval monks copied manuscripts for years, their ink-stained fingers teaching them patience. Farmers in every age rose with the sun, their bodies repeating the eternal rhythm of planting and harvesting, learning through the soil itself the value of constancy. Marco, too, was being initiated into that lineage of quiet lessons, the kindness speak without words. When at last he returned to the porch where the old man waited, Marco let out a long breath. He held out the glass proudly, his voice trembling with relief. "Grandfather, I did it. I did not spill a single drop." The old man nodded slowly, his eyes gleaming with approval. But instead of praise, he asked a question. "Tell me, Marco, did you see the children playing by the road?" Marco blinked, surprised. "No, Did you hear the dogs barking? Again Marco shook his head. No, I was only watching the water. The old man's smile deepened, not with amusement, but with the joy of recognition. He had seen this moment many times before, in many seekers, and yet it never lost its power. He leaned forward slightly, his voice as gentle as the breeze stirring the vines. And that, he said softly, is the secret. Marco felt a shiver run through him, though he could not yet name why. Something in the old man's words carried more weight than the glass. He had just borne across the village. The old man let the silence linger, as though to allow Marco's restless mind to breathe for the first time in years. Then, with the same calm voice, he continued, when your eyes were on the glass, your whole being was in the present moment. You were not in the past, grieving over mistakes. You were not in the future, worrying about what might come. There was no space for confusion, no room for fear. There was only the water, and your steady steps. Marco's breath caught in his chest. He thought back to those minutes of walking, how the world had dissolved around him, how he had been consumed by a single task. For once, his thoughts had not scattered like frightened birds, they had been focused, precise, silent. He had not even realized it at the time, but yes, his mind had been still. The old man placed a hand gently on Marco's shoulder. Peace is not something you chase. It is not hiding in the mountains or buried in sacred books. It is not in the past, nor in the future. It is here, now, when your mind is anchored like the roots of a tree. Do you see? Tears welled in Marco's eyes, not from sorrow, but from the sudden recognition of truth. He had spent years haunted by memories and consumed by fears, searching for something far away, when the secret had always been within him. It was not that the world needed to change, it was that his attention, his awareness, could be trained, like the careful balance of the glass. History has recorded countless echoes of this same revelation. The Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius once wrote that the present moment is all we truly own, and to surrender it to regret or fear is to waste the gift of life. In distant monasteries, the masters taught their students to focus on a single breath, a single step, a single sound, until all distractions fell away. Sufi mystics spoke of polishing the heart until it became a mirror, reflecting only what is here and now. Across civilizations, the wisdom was the same. Peace is born not in chasing, but in presence. Marco listened, and as he did, he began to feel something unfamiliar rising in him. His shoulders, which had been tight for as long as he could remember, loosened. His breath, once shallow and hurried, slowed, and in the corner of his mouth, where a smile had not lived for years, a small curve appeared. It was not a smile forced for others, nor one painted by circumstance. It was a quiet smile of someone who had glimpsed a hidden truth. The old man leaned back, closing his eyes once more, as though the lesson were complete. But for Marco, the journey was only beginning. He understood that peace was not a treasure handed to him in a single moment. It was a practice, a discipline, a way of living that he must cultivate every day. The storm in his mind would not vanish overnight. Yet now, he held a compass, the knowledge that the present moment was his refuge, his anchor, his home dot. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long golden shadows across the quiet village, Marco stood in silence. For the first time in years, silence did not feel like an enemy. It felt like a friend. The road behind him had been long, and the road ahead would be longer still. But he no longer feared it. He had taken the first step into a deeper kind of life, the life of presence, of stillness, of peace. And so, the restless young man, who once felt lost in his own mind, discovered that the answer had been waiting within him all along.